In the spring of 1943, as the North African campaign collapsed around the remnants of the Afrika Korps and the last pockets of Axis resistance in Tunisia were crushed under the combined weight of British 8th Army and the American 2nd Corps, a small number of German Red Cross nurses, DRK-Schwestern, found themselves swept into captivity alongside the wounded soldiers they had been trying desperately to save. They had followed Wehrmacht field hospitals from Libya to Tunisia, enduring sandstorms, shortages, and constant air raids, and they expected their journey into American hands to be harsh, if not brutal. They were, after all, the enemy. Their patients were the enemy, and everything they had been taught, by propaganda, by rumor, by the whispered fears of frontline medics, told them that Allied captivity meant degradation. So, when the ambulances of the U.S. Army's 45th Evacuation Hospital pulled up to retrieve the wounded German prisoners, the nurses stiffened, bracing for hostility. American MPs checked their uniforms, their Red Cross armbands, their identification, and then calmly waved them aboard. No shouting, no threats, no retribution. Just a simple, almost businesslike efficiency. The DRK-Schwestern, exhausted and covered in dust, exchanged confused glances as the convoy rolled toward a U.S. medical clearing station set up near Kalibia. What they saw next stunned them. Rows of white tents, orderly and clean, canvas cots aligned with mathematical precision, buckets of sterilizing solution at the entrance, and American medics treating German, Italian, and Allied wounded under the same roof. No segregation except for preventing tensions, no refusal of care, no triage lines based on nationality. A surgeon barked orders to a nurse, and the translation, intended for the German prisoners, was calm and respectful. One DRK nurse whispered to another, "They treat ours like their own." It was the first crack in a worldview shaped by years of war. When the wounded were stabilized and ready for evacuation, the nurses accompanied them, first to Bizerte, then by hospital ship across the Atlantic. Their journey aboard U.S. medical vessels, far cleaner and better supplied than anything the Wehrmacht had fielded since 1941, exposed them to a medical system fundamentally different from their own. While German hospital ships were increasingly targeted and short on supplies, American ships carried blood plasma, sulfa drugs, and even early shipments of penicillin, which the U.S. Army began distributing in 1943. Nurses watched American medics check temperatures every hour, replace dressings with sterile technique, and chart every vital sign meticulously. The DRK nurses expected scorn. Instead, they were treated as medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention. They slept in designated quarters, received rations nearly identical to U.S. staff, and were permitted to assist with German patients. For women who had worked in collapsing field hospitals at Tebessa and Enfideville, where supplies were scarce, water was limited, and the wounded often lay in sandbag-lined pits, this was indescribable. They whispered among themselves, "This is not war. This is something else." When the ship reached Norfolk or Boston, the captured wounded were transported to long-term POW medical facilities. The nurses, still wearing their DRK badges, were sent to Camp Opelika, Alabama, or to hospitals like Glennan General Hospital in New Mexico, where large numbers of German wounded were treated. What awaited them there was beyond anything they had imagined. Full hospital wards staffed with American doctors trained in the newest battlefield techniques, sterilized surgical suites, X-ray machines running around the clock, and laboratories capable of processing cultures and performing blood work. Inside Glennan General Hospital, the DRK-Schwestern found that their patients, men who had collapsed on Tunisian sand with gangrenous wounds or shrapnel embedded deep in muscle, were placed on clean sheets, given regular morphine doses according to pain charts, and assigned dietary plans by American nutritionists. They were shocked to see penicillin administered to German POWs before it was widely available even to many German frontline units. The triage system astonished them most. Americans used a standardized method designed to save the greatest number of lives, prioritizing based on severity rather than nationality. For nurses who had watched Wehrmacht doctors forced to ration every ampule of morphine, every strip of bandage, every antiseptic tablet, especially on the Eastern Front, where shortages were catastrophic, the abundance was surreal. At Camp Opelika, German POWs undergoing surgery received blood plasma even when American supplies were strained. At Glennan General, infected wounds were treated with irrigation protocols and sulfa drugs that German doctors often lacked after 1942 due to Allied bombing of chemical plants. As days turned into weeks, the German nurses observed something they had never seen during their service under the Reich: a medical system that operated without fear, without shortages, without triage bias, and without ideology. POWs were not referred to as enemy wounded. They were simply patients. American nurses from the Army Nurse Corps, ANC, addressed them gently, used basic German phrases to reassure them, and followed U.S. Army medical doctrine without exception. The DRK nurses began to realize they were witnessing something that contradicted everything they had believed about the enemy. The United States was treating wounded German soldiers better than Germany itself could treat its own on many fronts. And this was only their first shock. The deeper revelations, the penicillin miracles, the clean wards, and the ethical neutrality of American triage were still to come. From the moment the DRK-Schwesterns stepped into the main wards of the 45th Evacuation Hospital, and later into the pristine corridors of Glennan General Hospital, they entered a world of medicine so far beyond the exhausted and resource-starved systems of the Wehrmacht that many of them genuinely believed they were witnessing a different century. The contrast was not subtle, it was overwhelming. In North Africa, they had treated septic wounds with boiled water when antiseptics ran out. They had reused dressings because convoys carrying medical supplies never reached their forward stations. They had watched gangrene spread simply because they had no sulfonamides left. Yet here, in an enemy hospital thousands of miles from home, they saw American orderlies carrying trays of sulfa powder, sterile bandages, morphine syrettes, plasma bottles, and antibiotics as if such supplies were inexhaustible. For the DRK nurses, the greatest shock came when they witnessed something they had never seen in their own wartime hospitals: penicillin. The U.S. Army began distributing penicillin to frontline and stateside hospitals in 1943, first in limited quantities and then rapidly expanding throughout 1944. German forces, on the other hand, had no access to mass-produced penicillin. The Reich never achieved large-scale production and relied mostly on older sulfonamides. To the German nurses, penicillin might as well have been a miracle drug. They watched American doctors inject it into POWs, men who, under German care, would have died of sepsis. They watched fevers break, infections shrink, and amputations become unnecessary. In one case at Glennan General, a young panzer grenadier whose leg wound was already necrotic in Tunisia made a full recovery after IV penicillin and plasma therapy. A DRK nurse wrote later in a letter that we believed he had no chance. In America, they saved him as though it were simple. Then came the blood and plasma shock. The Wehrmacht had competent surgeons, brave nurses, and well-organized medical battalions, but what it lacked, especially after 1942, was blood. Allied bombing crippled chemical and medical production, and Eastern Front supply lines were so overloaded with ammunition and fuel that refrigerated blood shipments were a luxury. Plasma existed in the German system, but nowhere near the scale of the U.S. Army's industrial blood bank program. At American hospitals, blood plasma bottles hung from rails in neat rows, ready to be administered at any hour. Shock patients received transfusions in minutes. German nurses could only stare as U.S. Army medics stabilized men they themselves had believed were beyond saving.
One DRK sister in Camp Opelika, trained in triage during the brutal winter battles on the Don River, whispered to another, "In Russia, this man would have been dead before dawn." But if penicillin and plasma amazed them, the next discovery unsettled them even more: the American triage system. In the Wehrmacht, especially after 1943, triage was increasingly dictated by battlefield pragmatism. Supplies were short, stretchers were short, antibiotics were short. Priority went to those most likely to return to combat. Severely wounded POWs, even when treated decently, were nearly always the last in line. It wasn't cruelty, it was necessity. Germany simply didn't have enough. In American hospitals, the DRK nurses watched a completely different philosophy. Triage followed U.S. Army doctrine. Urgency of injury dictated priority, not nationality, not usefulness, not rank, not ideology. A critically wounded German POW went ahead of an American infantryman whose injuries were less serious. The American soldiers voiced no complaint, the medical staff didn't hesitate, the doctors didn't even blink. They simply followed protocol. For the DRK nurses who came from a system strained to breaking, where decisions were brutal and resources rationed, this was almost incomprehensible. They began following American procedures closely, helping with wound irrigation, bandage changes, IV insertions, and postoperative monitoring. They saw that every patient had a chart. Every chart had vital signs logged at precise intervals. Every post-op patient had pain assessments recorded. In Tunisia, they had worked under canvas tents where dust blew into open wounds and where surgeons sometimes had to operate under lantern light. In America, surgical suites were fully equipped, well-lit, climate-controlled, and sterilized constantly. They were also stunned by the amount of staff. American hospitals had dedicated anesthetists, laboratory technicians, X-ray operators, dietitians, physical therapists, and entire nursing teams. The Wehrmacht's frontline hospitals, especially late in the war, often relied on a handful of exhausted doctors supported by whatever nurses had survived the retreats. Perhaps the moment that most crystallized the DRK nurses' shock came at Glennan General when an American head nurse explained, matter-of-factly, that every POW, German or otherwise, was entitled to the same standard of care as an American soldier as mandated by the Geneva Convention and enforced by the War Department. It wasn't a courtesy, it wasn't an act of generosity, it was the rule. For the German nurses, raised in a wartime system collapsing under shortages and ideology, the clarity and neutrality of American medical policy felt almost unreal. They found themselves questioning what they had accepted as normal for years, improvising supplies, rationing painkillers, prioritizing soldiers based on combat value, and losing patients who might have survived had they received the kind of treatment now unfolding before their eyes. The shock grew deeper each day, and in the weeks ahead, as they accompanied patients through recovery, physical therapy, and long-term rehabilitation in the POW wards of Glennan General and Camp Opelika, the DRK-Schwesterns would come to a painful realization. America was not only treating wounded Germans as well as its own, it was treating them better than Germany could treat its own wounded in the final years of the war.
When the DRK-Schwesterns were finally settled into their long-term assignments at Camp Opelika in Alabama and Glennan General Hospital in New Mexico, they felt as if they had stepped into another universe, one where the rules of wartime medicine had been rewritten or perhaps erased entirely. For women who had served in the makeshift surgical huts of Tunisia, in bomb-shaken field stations outside Infidaville, or in the primitive frontline hospitals supporting the 10th Panzer Division, the American facilities seemed unreal. The first shock was simply space and cleanliness. Camp Opelika's POW hospital had wide, brightly lit wards, polished floors, running water that was always hot, and windows that closed properly, luxuries few theaters of war could sustain. Glennan General went even further. Tiled surgical theaters, steam sterilizers running non-stop, full dental suites and recovery rooms arranged with nearly mathematical precision. German nurses used to triaging patients under shell fire now watched American orderlies mop floors twice a day and replace linens every morning. One DRK-Schwestern later wrote, "I felt as though I had entered a civilian hospital before the war, except we were all prisoners." But the deeper shock was the standard of care provided to POWs, which exceeded even what most Wehrmacht soldiers experienced in 1944-45. At Camp Opelika, German wounded were issued clean pajamas, blankets, and mattresses softer than anything the Eastern Front had ever offered. They received 3 full meals a day based on U.S. Army ration standards: meat, potatoes, vegetables, milk, and additional nutritional supplements for patients recovering from major surgery. In Germany, by late 1944, even hospitals in cities like Munich and Dresden struggled to feed their own wounded adequately. Food shortages were so severe that many convalescent soldiers discharged from Wehrmacht hospitals suffered malnutrition. The DRK nurses could only watch, stunned, as American cooks delivered fresh trays of hot food to men wearing German dog tags. Medical routines followed strict schedules. Dressings were changed twice daily. Infections that had raged in North Africa were aggressively treated with penicillin and sulfa drugs. Patients who would have been amputees in Tunisia now regained full mobility thanks to early American physical therapy techniques. Glennan General even offered rehabilitation wards, something unheard of in most Wehrmacht hospitals after 1943 due to shortages in staff, equipment, and time. A DRK sister who had worked in a casualty clearing station outside Kharkiv whispered to another nurse, "Our men at home never saw care like this." The Germans were also stunned by the consistency of American standards. Every wound was charted. Vital signs were logged with clockwork regularity. The hospitals used a color-coded triage tag system, ensuring no patient, American or German, slipped through the cracks. When a newly arrived POW transport from Tennessee brought in several badly burned Panzer Grenadiers, the American staff immediately created individualized treatment plans, complete with diet sheets, pain management schedules, and recovery projections. The DRK-Schwestern stood silently as American nurses prepared hydrotherapy baths and applied silver sulfadiazine to wounds, treatments that were rare luxuries in the collapsing medical infrastructure of Germany. It was not only medicine that shocked them, it was the lack of hostility. American Army Nurse Corps personnel treated German nurses professionally, sometimes even warmly. They offered training on new equipment, invited DRK sisters to observe surgeries, and explained innovations such as sterile glove techniques, suction apparatus, and post-operative monitoring. In one recorded case at Glennan General, an American head nurse shared her personal stethoscope with a German Red Cross nurse because she needs to hear for herself how the lungs sound after penicillin does its work. The DRK nurses could hardly process this. They had been taught that Allied soldiers, especially Americans, would treat Germans with contempt. Instead, they were being included, cautiously of course, as prisoners, but seen as fellow medical professionals. The culture shock deepened when they learned that American surgeons were rotating through stateside hospitals after frontline duty in Italy or France, meaning the doctors treating German POWs had just treated American wounded days earlier, and yet their professionalism never faltered. Nothing illustrated this more clearly than the post-operative wards. At Opelika, German amputees were fitted with temporary prosthetics and assigned physical therapists who spent hours helping them walk again. In 1944 Germany, many amputees were discharged with crude wooden limbs or no prosthetics at all because factories had been bombed or raw materials were gone. At Glennan General, men with shattered limbs received orthopedic surgeries impossible in beleaguered Wehrmacht hospitals. One moment haunted many DRK nurses forever. A badly injured German lieutenant, shot through the abdomen, septic, and barely conscious, was wheeled into surgery. The American team worked for hours.
When the operation ended, the chief surgeon told the nurse beside him, "He's stable. We're not losing him today." A DRK-Schwestern who overheard burst into tears. In Wehrmacht hospitals on the front line, an enemy officer would never have received hours of surgery from the best staff on duty. As weeks passed, the German nurses realized something almost painful. American hospitals treated their wounded with a level of resources, structure, and compassion that Germany could no longer provide even for its own soldiers. They saw a medical system operating far from the front, backed by industry, logistics, and training programs untouched by bombing or shortages. They saw a system designed not to survive war, but to master it. And they began to understand that the care Germany could give its own men, especially on the Eastern Front, had already degraded beyond recovery. What they witnessed next would deepen that realization into something heavier, not just a difference in resources, but a difference in philosophy, a difference in what medicine meant during war, a difference in how an army viewed human life, even the life of its enemies.
What most unsettled the DRK-Schwesterns during their months inside Camp Opelika and Glennan General Hospital was not the abundance of supplies or the modern treatments or even the miracle of penicillin. It was the attitude, the quiet, unwavering conviction among American medical personnel that wounded Germans were not enemies to be punished, but human beings to be healed. This was not a slogan. It was a lived principle. The German nurses had come from a medical system where war dictated priorities, where shortages forced brutal triage, where ideology seeped into hospital corridors, and where enemy prisoners often received the bare minimum because resources simply did not exist. In America, they saw something entirely foreign: medical neutrality practiced without hesitation. It began with the tone of the American staff. In the 45th Evacuation Hospital, an Army Nurse Corps lieutenant addressed a severely wounded German private as "Sir," not as "prisoner." She spoke slowly, gently, using simple English phrases mixed with a few memorized German words. "Keine Angst, you're safe, we help." The German nurses watched this with astonishment. They had never seen such formality extended to enemy wounded. Even more shocking, American orderlies often made small gestures, a cup of cold water, an extra blanket, a pillow adjustment, that seemed trivial but carried enormous emotional weight for men who had suffered in dust-filled North African bunkers or freezing Eastern Front dugouts. But the true shock came in the operating theaters. At Glennan General, a German non-commissioned officer with a shattered femur was moved directly into surgery ahead of 2 American infantrymen. The German nurses assumed the Americans were officers. Surely that was why the German was sent in first. But they soon learned the truth. The Americans had less severe injuries. The German's leg might be saved if the surgeons acted immediately. That alone determined priority. No rank, no nationality, no prejudice. This single moment rewrote the DRK nurses' understanding of wartime medicine. The neutrality extended everywhere. In the physical therapy ward, American therapists guided German POWs through exercises with the same attentiveness given to American soldiers. At Camp Opelika, a major with the U.S. Army Medical Corps insisted that every bandage change be performed by the book, regardless of whether the patient spoke English or bore a swastika on his uniform. The German nurses were stunned at how rigidly Americans enforced these standards. There was no good enough. There were no shortcuts for enemy wounded. Everything followed protocol. The way American staff interacted with German nurses shocked them even more. Instead of ignoring or sidelining them, U.S. personnel frequently asked for their assistance, treating them as trained professionals rather than captives. A DRK-Schwestern at Opelika was once asked to assist in a thoracocentesis procedure on a German POW because she knew the patient's temperament better.
Another was invited to observe how American surgeons used suction equipment, which was rarely available in German frontline hospitals. The openness of this exchange, the willingness to teach, to show, to explain, felt almost surreal to women who had spent years working under a system where secrecy and hierarchy were absolute. The differences in philosophy became most apparent in conversations the DRK nurses overheard between American staff. When discussing a patient's odds of survival, Americans spoke in terms of saving lives, not saving manpower, a phrase increasingly common in German military hospitals. In the Reich, especially after 1943, the medical system fought a losing battle against shortages and strategic collapse. Everything was rationed, everything was triaged, not only by severity, but by military utility. An infantryman expected to return to the front took precedence over a badly wounded artilleryman who might never fight again. A POW? They could wait. But at Glennan General, the DRK nurses heard surgeons debate not over which patient was more militarily useful, but over which treatment plan might reduce infection risk the fastest. They heard nurses discuss comfort, pain management, and emotional reassurance, concepts that had become luxuries in collapsing German hospitals. The difference was philosophical, fundamental, inescapable. Even the environment reflected this. POW wards were decorated with simple, calm colors. Windows were open to let in fresh air. Radios played music. One evening, the DRK nurses listened in bewilderment as a U.S. Army nurse read out loud from an American novel to 3 recovering German soldiers. Pain medication was delivered on schedule. Dressings were replaced before they could chafe. Physical therapy sessions were personalized. A German officer struggling to breathe after pneumonia was given a steam inhalation mask, something Germany could barely produce in 1945 due to industrial collapse. The Americans never threatened, never insulted, never degraded. Their discipline was impersonal, strict, but always professional. Even the guards posted outside the POW wards treated the patients with a faint but unmistakable respect. The DRK-Schwesterns could not help comparing this to the Eastern Front, where they had seen Soviet POWs receive minimal treatment because supplies were gone and casualties were endless. In America, the German nurses stood inside a medical system so stable, so confident, and so morally anchored that it did not need to compromise its ethics. And in the days ahead, as they witnessed rehabilitation programs, long-term recovery, and even psychological support for POWs, the DRK nurses would face an even deeper truth. America wasn't simply treating the wounded. America was healing them, even when they wore the enemy's uniform. When the war finally ended in May 1945 and the long process of repatriating German medical personnel began, the DRK-Schwesterns left Camp Opelika and Glennan General Hospital with emotions far more complicated than relief. They were returning to their homeland, to the families they had not seen in years, to the cities where they had trained before the war. Yet a sense of dread followed them home, not because they feared Allied mistreatment, but because they already suspected the truth. Germany was not the country they had left behind, and the contrast between what they had seen in American hospitals and what awaited them in the shattered Reich would be almost unbearable. The journey back to Europe was slow. Some nurses were transported across the Atlantic on hospital ships repurposed for repatriation, others by troop ships escorted by Allied destroyers. Along the way, they cared for German repatriates, many of whom had spent months or years as POWs. These men told stories of starvation on the Eastern Front, of collapsing medical care, of cities turned to rubble, of hospitals without heat, electricity, or supplies. The DRK-Schwesterns already knew shortages existed. They had witnessed them in Tunisia and during retreats in Italy. But they were not prepared for the scale of devastation they were about to see. When the ships docked in Bremerhaven or Cuxhaven, the nurses stepped off into landscapes so ruined they seemed unreal. Bombed-out train stations, cratered streets, lines of civilians waiting for bread, children in patched clothes scavenging for coal. Their first thought, the same thought nearly all of them recorded later, was, Our wounded at home never had a chance. In Dusseldorf, Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin, the returning nurses visited military hospitals, or what was left of them. Many facilities existed only as gutted shells. Others operated out of basements or school buildings. The shortages were catastrophic. There was no morphine, no sulfa, no plasma, no sterile dressings. Some hospitals used beds of straw because mattresses had burned during air raids. Surgeons improvised splints from scrap wood. Nurses boiled instruments in soup pots because the autoclaves had been destroyed. It was a level of deprivation that made the memories of American hospitals feel unreal, almost dreamlike. One DRK-Schwester who had worked at Glennan General Hospital described her shock upon seeing a Berlin convalescent ward in late 1945. There were men with amputations lying on bare boards. The air smelled of infection. I thought of our POWs in America with clean sheets and 3 meals a day, and I felt ashamed. Another wrote in her diary that she had watched American nurses treat septic wounds with antibiotics, while at home German surgeons were forced to amputate limbs that could have been saved with even basic supplies. The emotional impact went deeper than medical comparison. The DRK nurses realized that the United States, a nation thousands of miles from the battlefield, had built a medical system capable of healing both friend and enemy with the same precision and care. Germany, trapped in total war, had been unable to spare resources even for its own soldiers, let alone POWs. This realization sat heavily on the returning nurses. Many had believed they had served the finest medical system in Europe. Now they understood that even at its peak, Germany had never possessed the industrial capacity, logistical strength, or medical abundance that the Americans demonstrated effortlessly. For months after their return, the DRK-Schwesterns found themselves speaking quietly about what they had seen. Not in public, Germany was occupied, tensions were high, but among themselves. They talked about the sterile corridors of Glennan General, the sound of American nurses laughing in break rooms, the smell of disinfectant instead of cordite and dust, the steady rhythm of penicillin injections saving lives that would have been lost in Europe. They remembered American doctors explaining procedures without arrogance, American nurses sharing chocolate with recovering German POWs, and physical therapists coaxing men into walking again with patience that seemed limitless. One DRK-Schwester, who had worked at Glennan General, confessed years later that she had felt a kind of betrayal. Not because the Americans had treated her poorly, they hadn't, but because she realized how little Germany had been able to offer its own wounded. Our soldiers died for lack of supplies, not lack of skill, lack of supplies. And in America, even our prisoners received more than our sons at the front ever did. As the occupation years progressed and West Germany slowly rebuilt its hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, the DRK-Schwesterns played an important but often unrecognized role. They brought back not only memories, but knowledge. Techniques they had learned from American staff, standardized triage, sterile dressing changes, post-operative monitoring charts, physical therapy methods, and the early principles of antibiotic-based infection control. Many of these techniques helped shape the reconstruction of German nursing programs in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Yet the emotional memory persisted most strongly. One DRK-Schwester who had worked at Glennan General Hospital testified after the war that her time in American hospitals fundamentally changed her understanding of medical ethics. She had lived through a system twisted by necessity, scarcity, and ideology. In America, she had seen a system rooted in abundance and humanitarian principle. They did not equate the two. They did not pretend Germany could have done the same under bombardment and blockade. But they never forgot the difference. Decades later, long after the war had ended, many DRK-Schwesterns would still describe the same moment of realization, that in the final years of the war, American hospitals had treated wounded German soldiers better than Germany had treated its own, not out of charity, but because they possessed the resources, the structure, and the medical philosophy to do so. It was a realization that stayed with them for the rest of their lives, a painful, humbling testament to how completely the Reich had collapsed and how thoroughly American medicine had surpassed everything they had known.